Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, joined by William Albrecht and Erick Ybarra, both Catholics, and we're joined today by esteemed guest Dr. Thomas Pink. Dr. Pink, how are you?
Very well, Michael. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
Oh, we are absolutely honored to have you on today. So, once again, thank you for coming on. Let me go ahead and introduce you formally. Professor Pink is a professor of history and philosophy at Cambridge, where he also received his PhD after working for 4 years in London and New York for a city merchant bank. He returned to philosophy in 1990 as a research fellow at Churchill College, Cambridge. He then lectured at Sheffield University prior to moving to King's College as professor of philosophy in 1996. Did I get you right there, Professor Pink?
Sounds right. Yeah.
Very good. We are truly honored to have you on. You have been recommended by multiple people, although we've followed your work for years anyway. We've been engaging quite a few guests recently about different topics, but one of them has been, of course, Dignitatis Humanae, the issue of religious liberty. And so this is kind of what we wanted to discuss with you today. So let me maybe start out by asking, what exactly is your position on Dignitatis Humanae from the Second Vatican Council? Do you think that when it teaches in this document that it is perhaps in discontinuity with what was taught previously by the popes in the papal magisterium, or do you think that there is somewhat of a continuity here?
Strictly speaking, it's continuous with previous teaching. And that's because, in a way I'll explain, it makes use of a theological framework taught by Pope Leo XIII in the 1880s on the relations between church and state. But it uses that framework to do something very new, which is to assert in explicit terms a right to religious liberty against the state. That's a right not to be subject to coercive pressure, legal directives backed by threats of punishment in our religious behaviour. At any rate, where specifically religious issues like religious truth are at issue. Now, you don't get a magisterial document saying that before. And it doesn't come with a very clear explanation of how it's continuous with previous Catholic teaching. It has this bit saying that the Declaration preserves traditional teaching on the obligations of individuals and societies to Christ and his church. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't explain how the traditional teaching is preserved. And everyone knows that in the past, the Catholic Church expected states to recognize Catholicism publicly as true, and then to privilege Catholicism as the true religion. Sometimes by restricting public proselytization by non-Catholics, that sort of thing. So it kind of looks different, and it kind of looks inconsistent with that previous church policy. And there's the problem. So you've got this declaration that claims continuity, but seems to tell the state not to favour Catholicism through law, when the church once used to ask the state to favour Catholicism through law. So we got a puzzle.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one that has caused quite a bit of a stir and controversy among Catholic theologians. And so let me maybe ask you this question. So the rights that are granted by Dignitatis Humanae when it comes to religious liberty, would you say that these are civil rights that are granted by the state that must be granted by the state by nature?
Yes, I think that's right. Mm-hmm. The Declaration says it's concerning a sort of civil liberty.
Okay.
But it's clear that this civil liberty is seen as rooted in natural law. And that kind of increases the problem, because natural law doesn't change. So how does it become wrong for the state to behave to us in certain ways when it used to be all right for the state to behave in certain ways by favouring Catholicism? How can all this be explained in terms of an unchanging natural law? So the mystery starts deepening. But I think there is an explanation of what's going on.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I first became interested in this because I did a lot of historical work on 16th and 17th centuries, looking at Thomas Hobbes, who was definitely not a Catholic, and his Catholic opponents, or the people that Hobbes was particularly attacking. A lot of them were Jesuits, like Francisco Suarez and Cardinal Robert Bellarmine. And these Catholic writers, they're very influential, they're very important. I mean, Bellarmine is a cardinal. He helps run the Roman Inquisition, amongst other things. Suarez writes works on this area that are commissioned by Pope Paul V. And they put forward a very important model. It's sometimes called the soul-body model. And it says that there isn't just one legal, sovereign, coercive authority in the world. We now, we're modern people, we think that the state has a sort of monopoly of force. We all live after Max Weber. We think that the state is the exerciser of coercive legal authority. It's got the right to issue legal directives and enforce them by sanctions. But that's not Suarez and Bellarmine's view. They think that there are two kinds of sovereign coercive authority. There's the state, and then there's the church. And the church is just as much an authority with the right to make law and enforce that law by punishment as the state. And it's got a jurisdiction just like the state. Its jurisdiction isn't territorial, it comes with baptism. If you're validly baptized, you are subject to the coercive jurisdiction of the church. Hasn't changed, actually. That's the 1983 Code of Canon Law. And they think that the existence of the church has to do with a very important transformation in who gets to exercise authority. Before the coming of Christ, the state was the coercive authority, and it governed everything, including religion. Religion was natural religion available to us through reason. It was the worship of the one God, known by reason from natural things. And we had no doubt rights to liberty in relation to it, but they were limited, and just like rights to liberty of movement are limited, and the state could supervise everything overall for the common good by running a kind of natural religion. What Christ does is he completely changes this situation by changing the nature of religion. Religion is no longer just a worship of God known from created things as part of natural happiness in this life, an obligation we owe to God just as his creation. It's something new. We are offered a new destiny, salvation in heaven, the beatific vision of God, which is what the theologians call a supernatural end. It's not a natural end because it transcends anything that human nature is actually capable of. And the worship of God, religion now becomes about attaining this supernatural end through new sacraments made available by Christ to communicate divine grace through the community of the church. And so religion is taken away from the coercive authority of the state because it's now so different, and it's given to a new coercive authority, a new legal authority with the right to issue directives and enforce them by punishments. That's the church. Right. This model is called the soul-body model because the church is the soul, the state is the body, and they're supposed to interrelate like soul and body in a human person. The soul, the church, looks after the higher good of religion, which takes us to supernatural happiness. The body, the state, looks after the goods of this life. But it's got to cooperate with the church. It's got to recognize that Catholicism is true and then act. The state remains sovereign in civil matters, but it's got to act as the helper and agent of the church as far as running religion is concerned. So that's the model.
Excellent. And I do have some follow-up questions on that, but let me ask a follow-up question to the one previously. When it comes to the state granting religious liberty as, if you will, by nature, this would seem to imply that it's a natural right, and that this would mean that man has a natural right not to be constrained by the state. But how then does that fare with the Syllabus of Errors, particularly number 78, which seems to condemn that view? How can we reconcile those things?
The natural right to liberty is something we're all born with, and this is not a modern, newfangled idea. You'll get Francisco Suarez making this claim of Laws and God the Legislature. It comes out in 1613. We've all got this. We bear the image of God. We have a right to determine for ourselves what we do, so that other people can't come along and issue orders to us and back those orders up with threats of punishment, unless they've got authority. So I can't come along to you, Michael, or you, William, or you, Eric, and say, give me your money, or I'll send people with baseball bats round. You would say, look, go away. I have a natural right not to be subjected to that treatment from you. I've got a right to liberty. To do that sort of thing, I've got to have authority. And now we come to see why I might have a natural right to liberty, religious liberty against the state. Because it looks as though, according to this soul-body model, the state does not have any authority of its own over religion, any more than you or I have authority over religion. Suarez once addressed James I of England, saying, "You, most serene Majesty, are a sheep, not a shepherd. You have no authority over religion of your own." That means if you, just on your own authority, go along and tell people what to do in matters of religion, they can, if they're brave enough, but they have the right, if they're brave enough, to tell you to go away, not avoid interfering with their rights. So the state, on its own authority, since the coming of Christ, isn't in the business, hasn't the right, authority to go and tell people what to do in matters of religion. The church, on the other hand, does have that right. So what's going on is this. The soul-body model has the following theory. Once a state becomes publicly Christian, and it's a political community of the baptized, one of the duties to the church that comes with baptism, we all have duties to the church with baptism. You know, we have duties under canon law to support our pastors and all that sort of thing. But there are also political duties. We can be under a duty if we're ruling a ruler. It could be democratic, monarchical, oligarch, doesn't really matter what structure. But if we're part of a Christian community and we're ruling it, we have an obligation under baptism to offer the church support. And the church can then hire us, so to speak, to help the church exercise her authority in matters of religion. There's the old phrase, the state as the church's secular arm. And this idea of the secular arm is not of the state exercising its own authority in civil matters, like running a police force or whatever. That's not secular arm, that's just ordinary political authority. It's the state assisting the church in the exercise of the church's authority over religion. And while the state is commissioned by the church and in a position to act as commissioned agent, then the state does have the borrowed authority to tell us within limits, under the limits set by canon law, to do certain things in matters of religion.
So does that then mean that Dignitatis Humanae still approves of a secular arm of the church, if you will, of a confessional state that could put to death heretics?
It doesn't address that question.
Okay.
It very carefully doesn't address that question. We know what was behind the declaration. We should know, because when the declaration is being formulated, the drafting commission issues a whole series of interpretative, they're called relationes. They're interpretative statements that explain what the declaration means to the council fathers who are going to have to vote for or against it. So, it's got lots of expressions like what's a civil liberty, what sort of right do they have in mind? All these technical issues are being addressed in these relationes. And particularly in 1964 to 65, a whole series of interpretative statements or relationes come out from the drafting commission, which all appeal to Leo XIII. Now, Leo XIII is this late 19th century pope who very carefully says there are two legal orders. There's the civil order controlled by the state, and then there's the order of religion controlled by the church. And both church and state are potestates, they're powers, they're coercive authorities. This is the soul body model. In fact, Leo XIII in Immortale Dei in 1885 says we've got to understand the proper relationship between church and state as that between the soul and the body. Now, what the drafting commission does in 1964 is say, we're assuming Leo XIII's theory or doctrine, teaching of the two legal orders, the order of religion and the civil order. And they say the Declaration of Religious Liberty rests entirely on Leo XIII's distinction of orders. So what they're talking about is they're addressing the authority of the state in a context where the state is understood not to be acting as the agent of the church, to be acting in the civil order only. And it's addressing the right to religious liberty as a right based on natural law within the civil order in a context where the potestas or coercive authority running the civil order has no authority over religion. That's why we have a natural right against the state in matters of religion, which has suddenly become live because for the first time, for a very long time, the state is no longer being seen by the church to be acting as the church's coercive agent. But Dignitatis Humanae doesn't say that in the actual text. That's all coming out of the interpretative relationes that explain how the traditional doctrine is preserved. What the declaration doesn't say is anything about whether it's a good or a bad thing for the state to be detached from the church, for the state not to be publicly Christian. It's just assuming that situation.
Would you say that Dignitatis Humanae directly addresses the question of whether or not a person has the natural right to believe error?
I think from memory that there are interpretative relationes that says that you don't have a natural right to error. What you may have is a natural right not to be coerced out of error. There could be lots of things I have no moral right to do, but it doesn't follow that you or somebody down the road has a moral right to stop me doing these morally wrong things.
Yeah.
They've got to have the authority.
Now, does that only extend so far? Because it seems like at some point this can go too far, in particular with perhaps Satanists and things like groups like that. So would you say that maybe that could go too far?
Well, what's Satanism involve? It could involve two things. It could involve a violation or harm done to the good, specifically religion. So it could involve, I don't know, idolatrous worship of Satan, for example. Right. And I never.
Sure. Right.
Or it could involve crimes against goods of the civil order. So right. Indeed, in addition to idolatry worshipping Satan, I could offer infants up to him as sacrifice. So I kidnap local children and get my knife out. That would be a crime not only against religion, but against natural law morality at the level of the civil order governed by the state. And then the state can shut me down on its own authority. And actually, Dignitatis Humanae is very clear about this. I think paragraph 7 says, there is a public order permission for the state to involve itself in restricting religion. If religious activity violates public order, then the state can stop it. But again, the Relatione is very consistent. They say just public order is to do with the civil order. It's not to do with specifically religious good. Okay. So it's a very, very carefully written declaration. And the question, one, why should the state be detached from the church? That's one question. Because it was never seen as a good idea in the past.
Right.
I think there are two things going here. First, not that many states, even by 1965, were publicly Christian. Not many states were, in the relevant sense, political communities of the baptized. Certainly wasn't true of a lot of European states. Maybe Salazar's Portugal and Franco's Spain, but certainly not France. Italy marginally. So what you're dealing with is a situation where a lot of states are becoming increasingly publicly neutral. And if you are publicly neutral about religion, you can't really offer yourself to the church as a coercive agent. At the very least, you've got to be publicly Christian and make it clear that in the public realm that that's what you're about doing. So there's a change in the nature of the state. There's also, I think, a change in the nature of the church. And here it's actually much more theologically problematic. People like Jacques Maritain, to take a very important example, in the middle of the 20th century, increasingly thought that it was no longer necessary for the church's mission for states to be Catholic and to privilege Catholicism. I mean, if you read Jacques Maritain's Man and the State, it's all about that. And he's got a theory that we've left the sacral age of the Middle Ages. We're in this new, wonderful, new secular age where grace operates through the world in a way that allows church and state to remain in harmony without the state having to be Christian. And that means that he thinks that Maritain, and he was very closely linked to Paul VI. Paul VI was a big disciple of Maritain. They think that whilst there's nothing doctrinally erroneous in the traditional teaching about the cell-body union, the need to apply it is outdated. We've reached a new world in which there can be harmony between church and state without having to have the state publicly commit itself to the true religion. And so they kind of think it's all right to tell the state not to bother. which obviously is happening around the time after the Vatican II, where they're actually going to previously Catholic states and saying, we're going to change the Concordat. You can't privilege us anymore legally. Now, was this a good idea? And I think we've got a really interesting case of a tension between two things. There's what Vatican II publicly teaches magisterially. And I've been saying that's okay. And then there's what I call the background official theology. It's not itself magisterially taught, but is influencing the policy decisions that people are taking. Mm. And one thing is clear between the 19th century and the mid to late 20th century, there's a radical change in the official theology of grace. The 19th century popes think that a non-Christian, religiously neutral state is a disaster area, because they think that that will detach the state from divine grace. It will detach the political community from divine grace. And that will mean that the political community will depart from natural law. Because of the fall, grace is required not only to take us to the supernatural and to heaven, it's required to repair the damage done by the fall to human reason at the natural level. And people like Leo XIII and Pius IX are very clear that if you have a religiously neutral state that doesn't publicly commit itself to Christ, then public reason, the public reason of the state, will degrade in the order of nature. And you'll start getting things like denial of the right to life, strange views about marriage, just as in the days of the ancient Romans you had gladiatorial shows and infanticide. And people like Maritain thought, well, that's not going to happen anymore. I submit that the official theology of the 19th century is rather more accurate about what's coming our way than 20th century official theology.
Especially with the issue of abortion.
Yeah, marriage, you know. Yeah. I mean, I'm not saying that the 19th century states were unproblematic. I mean, you had little problems like slavery and one sure. But it's clearly mushrooming in just the way that the 19th century popes predicted.
So they predicted this. Wow.
Look,
Let me ask one more question, then I'm going to pass it on to Eric, then William. My last question to you is, would you say that Dignitatis Humanae preserves the doctrine that the church is a perfect society?
It, again, does not assert that doctrine because it doesn't address the authority of the church in the order of religion. But the very relationes that I've been discussing, of course, describe the church as a potestas. And potestas is a technical canonical term for a perfect society. It means it's got a sovereign authority in a certain area of life to issue laws and back those laws up with punishments.
What is what is the magisterial weight of the relatio?
It itself is not a magisterial document.
Okay.
But I would submit that you can't give a plausible interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae that goes against the official interpretation of it given to the Council of Fathers. And I would also submit that you're going to have to give it that interpretation if that's the only way of making it consistent with the earlier magisterium.
That makes sense. Very well put. I might have a chance to ask some more questions. I actually have to leave at 1 o'clock, so I don't know if I'll have another opportunity. So if I don't have another chance to ask you, I want to again thank you for your time and coming on this show. This was truly an honor.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for all your questions. Really helpful.
Absolutely. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Eric. Eric, what kind of questions and interaction do you have for Dr. Pink? I think we did we lose you there, Eric?
Coming through?
Yeah, you're coming through now.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Pink, for coming on again. One of the issues that comes up with this topic is the historical situation of Constantine the Great. And I was curious to know if you thought that there was a connection between what you're talking about, where the soul body relationship and the that tense duality that we see coming early in the late 4th century, where you have the Roman emperor taking from the Hellenistic idea of the king and the ruler of the realm, and responsible for the people towards God. But then you have this meddling into the church affairs. Um, we see this with Constantine's sons, and then it reaches a high point under the pontificate of Gelasius I. And there we get this theory of the two powers. That duality there, the two powers. Would you say that that's an important historical marker, setting the bedrock for this soul-body relationship that you that you had spoken about initially?
Well, you're introducing two powers, and that means two sovereign, lawmaking, capable of punishing lawbreakers, authorities. I think that the official Roman line that we're talking about is taught magisterially in very explicit terms relatively late on. I mean, I often say that Dignitatis Humanae is the last and most important exercise of Pope Leo XIII's teaching authority. And it's really Leo XIII who's most explicit about the whole thing. He's the one who really explicitly teaches that the state has no authority, coercive authority over religion. That's gone to the church. But one of the reasons why in the 16th century the Jesuit writers like Suarez and Bellarmine are putting forward this view is that it makes immediate sense of a lot of church tradition, particularly the canon law tradition. So you're right that often, particularly in the earlier time of the later Roman Empire, you will have emperors doing things that only popes would later do. But it's not clear what to think about that. By the Middle Ages, you're getting the view that there are elements of irregularity about some of these procedures, except insofar as the popes have tolerated after the event, or approved after the event, of whatever the emperor had initially been sort of stimulating. And you will get, within the canonical tradition, an increasing emphasis on the state's involvement in matters of religion as an agent of the church, as a kind of authority that the church will instruct when it comes to religion. And you'll see that at councils like Lateran IV, where the council will issue instructions to rulers about what to do about heresy, about what to do about non-Christian religions. And so you're reaching a sort of ever-increasing emphasis on the church detaching herself from the state where religion is concerned, asking the state to unite with her as somebody that the church will tell what to do where religion is concerned. So this is a tradition that emerges over time and then is given explicit magisterial recognition in the form of authoritative instructions addressing Catholic rulers as baptized people to be told what to do at Trent, for example. And then in this very explicit account of the relationships between church and state in the late 19th century.
Yeah, I think that this is a very important demonstration of what St. John Henry Newman called the development of doctrine, because in the pre-Nicene era of Christianity, you don't really see any theoretical anticipation of the church becoming a public and a political entity through the state. So you don't really have the Lord Jesus Christ and the apostles, including an addendum or a certain a pre-note on when the church finally comes around to being accepted by the state. There's no preparation. And so when the church moves into the 4th century, it seems that this is brand new territory. Would you agree?
Yes, I mean, I think that there are elements of the early church which anticipate a conception of the church herself that makes this kind of possible. Look, it's always very hard to tell what's going on in the early church. And I often think that at any given time, theories put forward within the later church, what's going on in the early church, tell you a lot about what the later church thinks, and what goes on in the later church, but very little about what's going on in the early church. So nowadays, people are very nervous about laws and punishments and coercion. And so we modern Christians tend to have a view of the early church as sweetness and light and no coercion or anything like that. And how could it have ever had anything to do with someone like Constantine? That must have been a defamation. But of course, if you read Counter-Reformation Catholic theologians about the early church, they're telling you lots of things about the early church, which make it highly muscly and coercive. What a surprise. So you get things like early church prohibitions, which you get in the New Testament and also in the Fathers. Christians aren't allowed to go to pagan courts to resolve legal matters. They're meant to go to courts run by fellow Christians. Well, that's treating the church as a relation baptized as a kind of coercive authority. You'll get St. Paul talking of handing someone over to Satan as for a punishment of the flesh, which tends to be advertised as a miscreant member of the Christian community being subjected to some corporal punishment for whatever the bad thing immorality they've been getting up to. So there is a sort of aspect of the early church that is much more temporal world involving than we now like to admit. And Counter-Reformation theologians were very, very sensitive to this. Again, the whole idea that bishops are shepherds. All of us, or most certainly people like me in London, have been brought up far away from the countryside. And we tend to have a rather romantic idea of shepherds. You go out and you gaze at your sheep and they gaze lovingly at you, and the only violence comes from the wolves. But if anyone knows shepherding, shepherds have to use coercive physical force on their sheep. That's why you have a virgo, a rod, a shepherd's crook thing to haul the sheep around. And Counter-Reformation writers are constantly saying, why should we think that the church has a coercive authority of a sort that the state could assist with? Well, the proof is from John chapter 21, where Christ appoints St. Peter, the apostles, as shepherds. And shepherds are ruling rational sheep, make laws and enforce those laws and punishments. So there's even the New Testament itself is much more revealing of this possible side of the church than a lot of modern Christians realize.
Yeah, I noticed that even before the let's call it the Constantinian Revolution, as a lot of the publicized works call it, in particular, Father Francis Dvornik, I was reading his one of his books on the nature of ecumenical councils, and he did say that before the Edict of Milan, the church had already sort of adopted some of the Roman dress of legality into her own polity, provincial councils and things like that. But what we soon see is this instance that the emperor has the right to call ecumenical councils. And we don't really see the idea of the Pope having the right to call an ecumenical council, that becomes a consideration to be put down in magisterial writ later on. But could you comment on that? That, you know, when did the church realize that, okay, the state can't just call an ecumenical council in opposition to the church? You know, we see that already with the Council of Hieria in 754 against the images, against the Seventh Council. When do you see the popes really saying, okay, the state is really serving the church, and in particular, the head of the church has prominent, sway in how that's going to be conducted?
Well, look, this isn't an area where I have a particular expertise,
Okay.
but I think you can get passages in sort of Gregory the Great where he's clearly regarding the Eastern Emperor as a sort of an assistant figure rather than somebody who he can tell him how to run the church. I think that it's a complex interrelation between de facto power and the lack of any obvious, which is obviously belonging to the emperors and various other local rulers, including the new Germanic kings. They've got the power in terms of actual, crunchy force, but there's really no compelling theological reason why they should have any authority to exercise that power. And I think it's that realization that there's no story about why, Odoacer or Justinian or some other sort of ruler should exercise office within the church just as a temporal ruler that is corrosive of a sort of Caesaro-papist, make the emperor the effective pope regime. But it always comes back within Western Catholicism. So, the classic example of this is Gallicanism in the French church, which is taking off in the late Middle Ages. And it becomes a position whereby essentially they deny that the church has any temporal authority whatsoever, even for religious ends. And so they can excommunicate you, but if we want to sort of fine heretics or impose any temporal punishments, or change anything in the church that involves temporal goods, then that's business of the King of France and the Paris Parliament and things like that. Well, the problem with that is that it's not clear on what basis you say that. And one of the very interesting features, which is more within my period of 16th century Gallican thought, particularly the Gallicanism of the Paris Parliament, they're all lawyers basically, is that they really cannot provide a theoretical rationale for why the King of France should be running the church in this way or running religion in this way. It's simply not there. He's just a passing temporal ruler. He's not a successor of the apostles. And so there's a sense in which what's now the Orthodox Catholic line, though it's not always formally taught magisterially, is the only one that's really got a convincing theological rationale. So it's always there to win, so to speak.
Yeah, one last question here, to change gears a bit. Based on your gloss on all of this, would you say that it's possible for a pope? This wouldn't happen in our lifetime probably, but would you say it's theoretically possible for a pope to overnight change the policy of Dignitatis Humanae and what grew to that point, so that now the church is going to ask the state to assist her, and then immediately start acting upon that policy? Or would you say that is strictly forbidden in theory?
There's no obstacle to a pope coming along and saying, this is the basis on which Dignitatis Humanae was passed. It assumes this Leonine political theology, soul body model. And actually, we think that it was a mistake to encourage states to detach themselves from the church. So we are going to call, when we call on people to convert, we want to call them to convert as political communities. You can do that. Bear in mind, until political communities become Christian again, that won't have any practical effect. It probably will get you lots of bad coverage at the United Nations, but it won't otherwise do any good. With one of the reasons why it's not likely to happen anytime soon. One of the reasons why Dignitatis Humanae was clearly passed is that it was getting embarrassing in a world where the Pope increasingly wanted to be a big figure within the non-Catholic world, to have regimes like Spain, etc., that were privileging Catholicism and making it difficult for Protestants to be Protestant in the public sphere. It was becoming, people like Anthony Eden, when he was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, would say, look, we're simply not going to have a nuncio in London, we'll only have an apostolic delegate until Rome changes its treatment of Spanish Protestants, etc. So you can see why it was very convenient to do this. And I don't see it changing anytime soon. And there are only limited ways in which it could immediately change, as I said. And some of my colleagues, well, I'm down in the public sphere now as an integralist. I occasionally do things in public discourse saying why integralism, the idea that there should be a Catholic state, is technically church teaching. But unlike some of my integralist colleagues, I don't think this is actually going to happen. I think that the truth that the state should be Catholic is much more important as a way of understanding how political societies function. States aren't just, protection societies or coordination societies that enable free markets to work, unlike some of my perhaps neoconservative friends. They're a business of creating ethical communities. States, for example, are in the business of running things like family structure and getting people to form a consensus about how families should work. I don't know of many states that have been neutral in these matters. The reason why you need a Catholic state then is that because of the effect of the fall, you won't be guaranteed to get a state that runs things like families in a way that consistent with natural law, unless it's elevated and cleansed by divine grace. So you better realize that. You better realize that while you have a secular state, you will have grief. And that's the message. You shouldn't be surprised. I think a certain generation of bishop after Vatican II was kind of a bit surprised when, secular states started playing nasty. They were supposed to be nice. We're supposed to be all one big happy family without them having to be Catholic. Well, you shouldn't be surprised. That's the lesson from all this.
All right, William, you can take the mic.
Thank you very much for that, Eric. And I think you've been great, Dr. Pink and Eric as well. I do know that that Michael has to go really soon. Michael, you don't want to chime in for maybe about 3 or 4 minutes before you have to head out?
I know you've touched on this a little bit, but I guess I want to just make it very clear for anybody who's watching. Do you think that there should be a distinction between church and state?
Let
me put it that way.
A distinction, because they are two different coercive authorities, different in that they're based on different kinds of law. The state's authority is based on natural law. The church's authority is based on a revealed law, the law of the New Testament, revealed by Christ. And they look after different goods. The church looks after the good of religion. The state looks after goods like movement through space, transport, education, and non-specifically religious matters. All these other important things. Mm-hmm. You've got to distinguish between them. Mm-hmm. But they should ideally form a single community, because Christianity has got to transform everything on this earth. That's what Pius XI was saying when he was teaching so strongly on behalf of the social kingship of Christ. The political realm can't be a Christ-free zone. Christ's kingdom is not of this earth, So the social kingship of Christ is not about kingdom of heaven as some political state on this earth, but it's one that requires the total commitment of humanity. Mm-hmm. And that means commitment not just of private individuals, but of families and of their political communities as well, once they are united as a Christian community.
And one other, and then I have to head out here. What would you suggest is the way for the church, and I guess by extension state, to move forward out of the situation that we're currently in? What's the best approach to move forward?
Well, I don't think you will get a transformation of the state while political communities remain non-Christian. By the very nature, I think the 19th century popes were right about that. Mm-hmm. But the 19th century popes knew that when Leo XIII was writing this stuff, he realized that already then most states were not Catholic. Italy was a newly united kingdom, which was quite anti-clerical. So he's putting forward this teaching as a way of accustoming people to understand what ought to be the case, so that you can understand why things are bad when it isn't the case. And I think one of the things that the church has got to do to go forward, one is actually to convert people, would be a good idea. Because if you don't convert people, you will get grief from them. The other is to realize that until you manage to carry this off, you will live in a relationship of extreme tension. Mm-hmm. The non-Christian is your neighbor, but they are subject of the prince of this world, as Christ is very clear in the New Testament. That is going to lead to a spiritually conflictual relationship with them, insofar as they are subject to another aggressive spiritual influence. I think one's just got to be very explicit about this.
Excellent. Well, once again, thank you so much, Dr. Pink. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to William.
Dr. Pink, I think you've been incredible. Michael and Eric, y'all have given him incredible questions. Dr. Pink, you were talking a little bit earlier about elements of the early church that seem to have anticipated this. Are you aware of maybe any early fathers, perhaps not in the apostolic era, but maybe pre-Nicene, that touch upon the issue of religious freedom? Are you aware of any, maybe?
You do get, again, this is not an area of expertise. I'm not a patristics man at all. You do get people, passages from Dignitatis, I think, etc., which seem to disavow or be rather cool about use of coercion in religion. But it looks as though they've got an eye to the pagan Roman state and its activities as much as anything else. We do know, for example, in Augustine's life, that he, and this is obviously post-Constantinian, but he suffers or is involved in a change of attitude to the state's involvement in religion as a Christian empire. The issue of treatment of Donatists in North Africa, where initially he was opposed to state action to get rid of schism and heresy, and then comes around to the view that actually, when moderate and judicious, it actually is quite effective. So, whole towns of Donatists are now Catholic. Yeah. And he says that this is probably fine. I rather sympathise with his attitude. I think that you may have the right to do certain things in matters of religion, and it may be that for example, Counter-Reformation Church had the strict right and authority to punish heretics fairly severely. But of course, for punishment to be fully justified, it's not a question of whether it comes with proper authority. It's also got to be authority being exercised in a prudent manner for the good of the community it serves. And I suspect it might well be true that quite a lot of past uses of ecclesial authority, just as of state authority, have not always been prudent by any manner of means, and have probably done more long-term damage than good. I suspect, though, we're now living in a world where there probably isn't enough. People sometimes look at the clerical abuse crisis as an example where the church's self-understanding as having a punitive authority has unfortunately been put on the back burner.
Yeah, that is correct. Another thing that I wonder what your thoughts are. You frequently hear people hearkening to the 1917 code, which, if I'm correct, is itself hearkening to the Trent, I believe, session 25, chapter 20, where it's talking about calling on Catholic leaders, Catholic rulers, and dealing upon the issue of enforcing church laws in a general fashion. And at times you hear people levy the criticism that there is a clear contradiction here in Dignitatis Humanae. What are your thoughts on that when we examine the 1917 code? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are in that regard.
This is Canon 2198.
Right.
Where the Church claims the right to call on the state as a secular arm to enforce ecclesiastical law when necessary. Well, this is simply not addressed in Dignitatis Humanae because precisely because the state will be acting as the secular arm, this will be an exercise of coercive authority in the order of religion on the authority of the Church, and the Declaration doesn't address that. So it's simply not addressed. All that's happened is since they no longer want states to do that, they've dropped that paragraph from that canon from the 1983 code. But of course, you can have an authority and choose not to exercise it, and that's what's clearly going on there. So the Church has an authority, under certain conditions at any rate, to call on publicly Catholic states to act as a secular arm, but you can also choose not to use that. So there's no inconsistency. There's a massive change in policy, and I've been suggesting a not entirely unproblematic one.
Very good, very good. Well, we do have some questions that I do want to get to, so you can have enough time to be able to touch upon them. One of them comes from a gentleman who is asking, how much threat of communism influenced the Dignitatis Humanae?
I think communism was, I don't think it was a case of the communists saying, pass Dignitatis Humanae or we'll make life nasty for you. I think it was much more a case of, it will make us much easier, particularly Eastern European bishops thinking, it'd be much easier for us to resist the incursions of communist regimes into matters of religion if we can put a big distance between ourselves and the state in a way that puts the state under a general prohibition of involving itself in religion. And it's some of the biggest supporters of Dignitatis Humanae were Eastern European bishops. Some of them actually had some quite strange theological ideas. I remember reading the acta of the council. The Archbishop of Prague at the time was completely liberal on religious liberty. He wouldn't have liked what I'm saying at all. He clearly denied Leo XIII's teaching. So you get the drafting commission telling the council fathers, interpret all this in terms of Leo XIII. And you get the Cardinal Archbishop of Prague saying, any form of coercion in religion is completely unjustified. It's a terrible thing we used to do. Which tells you how messy councils are. But you can see why someone from Prague living under communism might well just want to say, let's treat religion as a coercion-free zone. And then we got a very easy message to use against totalitarian atheism.
Very good, very good. We do have another question from a gentleman by the name of Nazim. If the state has the authority to coerce in matters of religion only because of the Church, then what about the fact that the state has the right by itself to coerce when it comes to what can be known about religion through natural reason?
It's an extremely good question. You will get, if you look at Counter-Reformation, again, you can tell I'm a Counter-Reformation man, that's my expertise. Counter-Reformation theologians, they're often a bit sort of schizophrenic on this. So sometimes when they're discussing state authority, they think the state still has an authority over natural religion. Religion is available to reason. And then sometimes when they're talking about matters to do with canon law and the Church, they will say religion as such has been taken away from the state and given to the Church. And sometimes you'll get the same author saying both things in different works. Suarez will do that. And you can see what the tension is. Look, the supernatural end transforms religion. But doesn't that still leave the option of natural religion? we've got an obligation at the level of nature to worship God. And as you say, as my questioner says, idolatry violates that. So why can't the state still get active here? I think that the reason why over time the church, I think at the level of the magisterium, moved to taking all religion and giving it to the church is that it's difficult to divide religion up into natural bits and supernatural bits. The supernaturalization of religion, it sort of transforms the whole thing. And then you need one authority to deal with this, not two competing authorities, one taking the point of view of prioritizing natural happiness and the other taking the point of view of prioritizing supernatural happiness. And so when you get to Leo XIII, in Immortality Dei, he's very clear that religion as such, as concerned with the worship of God, not just the supernatural end, but the worship of God, is under the authority of the church. But I would thought it's consistent with that to say something like this. The state could still be permitted by the church to exercise its authority at the level of nature. But because of the fundamentally, the unity of the religious end, the church has got to ultimately decide what's going to happen there. And I think that's the rationale for the shift even of natural religion to the church.
That's a fantastic response, Dr. Pink. I'm looking at the chat questions. We have so many really, really good questions. And there is one that I want to save towards the end. So perhaps I can allow you and Eric to both engage with it, because I think you both could give a great answer. We'll get to that in a little bit. I noticed one of them that is quite interesting, and if I may, I'll try to reframe it a little bit. A gentleman by the name of Jason Franklin. Let me try and reframe it. Is it true that the vast majority of bishops have perhaps rejected the interpretation of Dignitatis Humanae that you've presented? Would that, because of that, if that is true, would that invalidate the interpretation that you've given? What are your thoughts and the comments of this gentleman?
Right. I would imagine, look, I've not been contacted by the vast majority of bishops on this matter. Don't know anyone who has.
I agree.
I would say to Jason Franklin, I'm sure he's absolutely right that if you ask 9 out of 10 bishops what Dignitatis Humanae means, they'd say that religion rules out all forms of coercion, and no one has any right to coerce religious activity. That's what they'd say.
Yeah.
Then you'd say, well, Your Excellency, have you read the Code of Canon Law, which treats heresy, for example, as a punishable crime in the baptized, punishable by temporal as well as spiritual punishments? And then I think the bishop would get rather annoyed and tell you to shove off. Now, what does this mean? Well, I think Jason's question slightly assumed, well, he's not assuming this, but a lot of people might think that it's impossible for the bishops at any one time to be wrong about the meaning of a magisterial statement. I would beware of saying something like that. If you went back to 16th century Europe and asked various bishops around Europe what the Catholic teaching on justification was, I wouldn't bet a lot of money on getting a very accurate answer that would get you through a seminary examination on the Council of Trent. Bishops on the whole are not guaranteed to be individually infallible in their grasp of what the magisterium has taught in its correct interpretation. One of the things I'm writing about at the moment is what I call official theology, which is the amazing gaps that you can get between magisterial statements and what they clearly do mean, and what bishops and various other office holders at various times in the church have thought that they meant.
Yeah.
And the two things can be very different. I think with Dignitatis Humanae, to interpret it, I think you have to look at the interpretation given officially at the time by the people drawing the Ruddy Declaration up, who knew exactly what they had to do. If it becomes clear after the event that most bishops have lost touch with that interpretation, that's a problem for them, not a problem for the interpretation.
I agree 100%, Dr. Pink, and I would like to add that there is a massive need in the church for the work that you're doing. And I think you're doing an incredible job. I commend you for the amazing work that you're doing. And really, to be quite frank and honest, I don't think a number of bishops have even really touched upon this issue. And maybe quite a few really wouldn't know how to deal with it. So I do commend you for your great work on that.
Can I just
go ahead.
add one quick thing? There are bishops who do agree with my interpretation.
I agree.
It tells you about the present situation we're in that I couldn't possibly utter their names in public because they tell me this in confidence.
Oh, no doubt.
That actually is a rather worrying situation.
I agree. Oh, I agree 100%. And
that actually happens.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Doctor, we have, normally we probably wouldn't get to a question like this, but we have somebody asking in the chat. They would like to know what your thoughts are on the SSPX. I imagine in terms of what they have to say about religious liberty or about the document itself. Do you have any thoughts in their commentaries in regards to Dignitatis Humanae?
Right. Well, let me make it very clear from the start that I do not favour the SSPX's view of the declaration, which on the whole works something like this. They see the church as a sort of lawgiver in matters of religion, but the state has a native right to defend. This phrase I often hear from the SSPX. So the state has got a right autonomous of the church to defend Catholicism. This is very hard to understand because Leo XIII, in Immortale Dei and in Libertas, is very clear that the legislative authority and the coercive authority, authority to coerce, to actually enforce, go together. And obviously that's right, because if I make laws, but I don't actually decide who, or I'm not in charge of their enforcement, then I'm not really in control, because the enforcer will effectively decide what the law is as regards what people worry about. And I've never known anything in the canonical or legal jurisprudential tradition of the church that separates defence or coercion from legislation. So I'm not sympathetic to the SSPX's approach to this.
Right.
I think it's bad. It doesn't make sense of the canonical tradition. It doesn't make sense of Leo XIII. However, I don't really blame them that much, because having passed this declaration on the basis of these relationes, the church was in a perfect position when someone like Lefebvre expressed worry to say, well, look, you don't have a problem here because this is how it all works. But that would have required being honest about the church as a coercive authority.
Yeah. And
one of the really shaming aspects of this whole affair is that since the council, there was very little honesty about this. And of course, if the shepherds don't state the doctrine clearly and explain how it is continuous, there was a very, very feeble and evasive theologian's statement commissioned by the CDF in about the 1980s or thereabouts, which doesn't address the relationes and is fudgy, very fudgy. It would not convince anyone who was worried by the question. That's the best they did. And it's not even a magisterial. I mean, it was just a hard fudge. You cannot then blame people of integrity in what I'm afraid to say rather problematic state of the post-Vatican II Church, if having asked for an explanation, they're not given it.
Yeah.
They then start cooking up ideas of their own about the matter. And I think the SSPX attitude is deeply understandable because they're modern. We're all modern, and they're all used to the idea that the state is the coercive authority. So, of course, then you're going to have the state as having a native authority to defend and enforce church laws as like all other laws, because it's the monopoly of force. That's just not the historical Catholic view. In some ways, I see the SSPX as quite continuous with 16th and 17th century Gallicanism, which would have taken a similar view to them. But I don't really blame the SSPX, and to be frank, in many ways, I think Lefebvre was a great man. He was a great pastor. He was unfortunately not a great theologian, but he could see that things were going in a bad direction. And whenever I dealt with individual clergy of the SSPX, I've only had the greatest respect and admiration for them. And compared to what goes on in some more conventional parishes, I suspect they're doing a sterling job. I just don't buy the theology, that's all.
That was, Dr. Pink, that was a fantastic response. I do want to get to perhaps one final question, and I'd like for you and Eric maybe to interact a little bit, and then we can put a plug in for whatever you're doing and then wrap up the show. But this one very, very, very well does connect with what you just said about the post-Vatican II church. And I'd like to maybe see you and Eric, I guess, interact on this. It says, does Dr. Pink think it is possible that in the future, Vatican II will be discarded by the church? What do you two gentlemen think about that? Maybe Dr. Pink, you can give your thoughts, and maybe Eric, maybe you can interact with them a little bit. I wonder what you two gentlemen think about that.
It's not the way it works. It's never worked that way in the church. You don't disavow councils. You have later councils that moderate them, that put another side to it. But you don't disavow them. It's just not going to happen. I mean, well, who's going to predict the future nowadays? But it would be an unprecedented way for things to work in the church. What you will have in 100 years' time, perhaps, or 200 years' time, is some further council that will adapt to probably changes that have already been taking place in the church in ways that will remove a lot of problems.
Incredible. Eric, do you have any comment about that?
Is my audio coming through?
Great. Sounding great.
Okay. Yeah, I would agree with Dr. Pink. He's well more qualified to answer that question. The only thing I would say is that the future council may clarify something and or even annul something that took place before, if it was along the disciplinary matter. For example, the council, the Phocian councils, the 869 and 879, Catholics have continued to count the Council of Constantinople 869 as the eighth ecumenical council, but there was a council that styled itself as ecumenical 10 years after that in 879, and at that council they annulled the deposition and excommunication of Photius the Great. But that was it. I mean, the council itself pretended to annul the whole council, but the Pope really only agreed to the annulment of the sentence of excommunication. So I think that could take place at any time, but in terms of dogmatic teaching, there's no way. And there's debate on whether Vatican II really invoked extraordinary infallibility as a machinery to teach its decrees, and I think we're well on good ground in saying that it did not. But even so, a lot of it is just reiteration of traditional teaching, and it's probably the first time we have a council where the dogmatic answer in question is not really on the table. And so it's just one of the marvelous things about Vatican II. It's the largest council that the church has ever had, and it's the least one concerned about dogmatic answers. So it does come as a little bit of it's an oddity. But I don't see a possibility of the church saying that the gates of hell overcame us in the 60s and we got to get rid of this council. I really don't see that happening.
I agree with both you gentlemen. I agree completely. I don't see that happening at all. I was going to say in our lifetime, but really I don't see that ever happening at all. Dr. Pink, do you maybe have time for maybe one more chat that we can get to? Fantastic. Okay. We have a gentleman by the name of Murray who's wondering, how can we take Dignitatis Humanae's use of the terms all men and nor is anyone to be restrained and make it mean only the unbaptized? Doesn't this seem like calling a circle a square?
Right. Well, it doesn't mean only the unbaptized. This is a really good question. I myself have occasionally written incautiously about this, so let me make this very clear. It's not true that Dignitatis Humanae only addresses the unbaptized. It's also not true, strictly speaking, that it doesn't address the church as well as the state. Let me explain. When you look at the Relatio, it says the declaration is based on a distinction not between church and state, or between the baptized and the unbaptized, but between two legal orders, the order of religion and the civil order. And it's very important that everyone, baptized or unbaptized, and both authorities, church and state, can be involved in each order. And insofar as they're involved in the civil order, the declaration addresses them. Insofar as they're involved in the order of religion, it doesn't. So here's an example. I'm a baptized person, and I rent out some property to the church, to the local parish. The church is engaged with me as a baptized person, but in the civil order, because we're involved in a contract to do with a temporal good. And it's engaging with me simply as a provider of that temporal good, not as a baptized Christian, though I am baptized. In that respect, it governs the church's behavior in relation to me in the civil order. Here's another case. The state, as it once did, acts as the church's agent in the order of religion. It's acting in the order of religion, so it's the state. And there it's acting not as a potestas, but as an agent of the potestas of the order of religion. Here's another case. An unbaptized person starts interfering with the mission of the church. The church, to preserve the religious good, asks them to be cursed from not doing that. They're unbaptized, but they're dealing with the church in the order of religion because the church is exercising her authority to defend a specifically religious good. And although they're not themselves subject to the jurisdiction of the church directly, they are subject to what's called the indirect jurisdiction of the church. It's a bit like if I try and I'm not a US citizen, but I try and interfere with the US, they can kick me out. Well, so I'm an unbaptized person. I interfere with the religious mission of the church. The church can use her authority in the order of religion to coerce me out of it. So Dignitatis Humanae is not addressing unbaptized people, it's not addressing baptized people, it's not addressing church, it's not addressing state, it's addressing the civil order and everything that goes on in the civil order. And it's bypassing the order of religion and everything that goes on in the order of religion. And that, of course, it doesn't say explicitly that in the declaration, but the Relatio say it's to be understood in that way. And they're clearly making that clear when they say that the liberty in the declaration itself, the liberty is a civil liberty, a civil and social liberty, which means civil order in Leonine theology.
Fantastic answer. Great answer, Dr. Pink. I wonder, we can go ahead and wrap up the show now, but I wonder, can you put a plug in for anything you're doing? Maybe a paper you're writing, a book that you're working on, a webpage you want to direct people to? Anything you have in your mind, Doctor, feel free to put any plug in.
Well, if you're interested in any of my writings on this topic, I can be found on academia.edu. A lot of people know about this. It's that big academic site where people put their papers online. And if there's a single paper people should read, you just Google this, Thomas Pink, Dignitatis Humanae, Continuity after Leo XIII.
Incredible, incredible. Thank you very much for that. Eric as well, thank you so much. You gentlemen have been incredible. I mean, mind-blowing. I think this, in my opinion, this content and the show will be a great help and very fruitful for a lot of people that really want to know about the work that you've done, the topic that we've talked about, and everything we talked about today. I thank you very much for your time. Dr. Pink and Eric, you've been fantastic as usual. Thank you very much for that, Doctor.
Thank you, William. Thank you, Eric. And thanks, Michael. Honored to show.
No, pleasure is all ours. Thank you.
Bye.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. We will be live again on Saturday when we have Steve Ray with us. Thank you very much.